not very many of us today, but that's how it goes sometimes. Yeah, so I figured what we would do today was a little bit like so everything got sort of screwed up on Thursday. So I had grand ambitions for us to do a lot of James that we're not going to be able to do. There's just no possible way when I had to cancel. So I think we'll do today. We'll talk about the section I had you all read, but I figure instead, what's the end of the semester? There's not that much time left, really. Why don't we just sort of talk our way through the entirety of James's book, so including the bit I had you read, but I'll also just talk about the rest of it too. I think that should be interesting, at least give you a good sort of good. My guess is today we might even go a little short. And then what we'll do on Thursday is talk more with the final paper a little bit, strategies for how to approach it, that kind of thing. That's so yeah, that's my. I had a little bit grander ambitions than this for James, but life comes at you fast. All right. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts, comments, anything before we dive in? Magnus, go ahead. Yeah.
So the final paper,
Yes.
it's due on Tuesday. Is it
Fact,
due by
it's
the end of the
due
day
on Tuesday.
or okay?
Yeah, it's due on Tuesday. Yes. Yeah, by the end of
Okay,
the day. Yeah, by the end of the day. Yeah, because
cool.
that's when if we had a final, that's when our final would be. It would be due on Tuesday, but anyone who wants one, I'll give an extension to. It's not a big deal. I should have gotten back to everyone by now with papers, but that took far too long. I really apologize for how long it took me to get that second draft back. So anyone who needs an extension, it's not a problem. Good. Any other businessy thoughts, questions? All right, and I'm going to try the rest of this week to get caught up with the remaining daily assignments that I haven't graded yet, so that you should have a accurate sort of sense of where you stand in the course by the weekend. Is my hope. Everything but the final paper, pretty much.
I
Also,
also had a question, Paul. Sorry.
go ahead. That's fine.
You mentioned earlier that there was a resource, like a resource of different um like philosophy subjects that we could
Mm-hmm.
look into
Yep.
for our final paper as well.
I can. I'll pull it up right now for you. It's called the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it's a lot better than the normal things you might find about philosophers on like YouTube or whatever. So uh, here we go. Let's pull this. There we go. Yeah. So yeah, it's called Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I really recommend it as a source for a couple different reasons. First, the individual articles are all written by subject experts. So they're all written by people with PhDs who know what they are talking about. So let's just use an example. Kant, right? So it's valuable in that way. You know you're getting good stuff here, and it's written very much in a. I'm not going to tell you what I think about Kant. I'm going to tell you all the different things that people have thought about Kant who are experts in Kant, which is way better than just some one random person giving you their own idiosyncratic view. The other thing is super valuable, and you have an exhaustive work cited that you can use to find actual articles in. I prefer you not actually use Stanford Encyclopedia articles in the paper, but you can probably find an article in using the Stanford Encyclopedia article, then trace out the footnotes, find the actual article that way. It's a great way. I actually do it when I'm like making classes and stuff. That's actually a way that I'll find readings is looking through, because they do such a good job citing various kinds of footnotes and good arguments and interesting things. Awesome.
Thank you. That was very
Yeah,
helpful.
absolutely. Absolutely. Any others? Remember, I'm happy to go over those comments that I sent you all on the papers too. So you don't just have to sort of, I went fast because I wanted to really desperately get them done. So they might be a little sloppier than the first ones were. But if you have any questions about anything, you just want to talk about it, let me know. I'm available to go over it. Drafts are a little bit more questionable, but I'll try to look at drafts. there's just not a lot of time, and I'm actually more behind in a different class than I am in your class, believe it or not. So I'm gonna have to get grade a bunch of logic exams too, but I'll at least try my best. And if you maybe have like a shorter, like, what do you think about this paragraph, Paul, question, that's easy. I could definitely do that. Awesome. So any other questions for me? All right. So like I said, I had a little bit grander ambitions for James. I was thinking we would spend like sort of like 2.5 days or so, and I think let's just spend a day. There's not enough time at this point to really be worth stretching it out. He's a fascinating figure. I actually might try something a little different next time I teach this class. I might teach him earlier just to see how that changes the discussion. Because if you all noticed, he didn't talk about transcendence at all. He talked about the divine, but the divine, he did not define divinity in terms of transcendence either. He defined divinity as that which you hold serious and solemn. Right, so whatever one holds serious and solemn, that is what you hold divine. Right? And so that suggests a very different starting. If you start from that starting point, right, you're going to get different stuff. And indeed, that's what James does throughout this entire book. Other things that are sort of just fascinating and interesting, I think, with this book, he does a really good job of one way of approaching the paper that I've had you all write. Because I keep emphasizing, I don't care about the definition of words. I want to talk about phenomena. And that's what he basically just begins. He's like, define the word religion however you want. Stipulate whatever stupid definition you want for that. I don't care about the word. The phenomenon that I am interested in is the phenomenon of people, like in their own inner lives, holding things sacred, holding things as divine. And I want to talk about that phenomenon. Awesome, right? And he indeed then justifies why he's talking about that phenomenon rather than some other ones, right? Where he draws the line of the phenomenon that he looks at. So I mean, this again, I think I actually might start with this one before we start the Taylor next time, just to see what happens with it, to how it sort of changes the way students think about things. So yeah, then, you know, if you're still a little bit struggling with how to structure the paper, this is at least a model. You can at least model it off of what he's doing. I think what he's doing is quite interesting. He's interested in the exact opposite phenomenon than the one that I'm really interested in, because I'm interested in the social thing. That's the one that I find most interesting. It's the Al-Farabi stuff. But again, we're not talking about words. We're talking about phenomenon, and the phenomenon he's pointing toward does indeed seem to be a real one. So one well worth sort of looking at on top of everything else. He's sort of our culmination of this idea of looking at religion as a specific kind of experience. We've had variants of it so far with the Buddhists, with the sense of this meditative experience that's sort of where you gain a certain kind of knowledge of the true structure of reality. We saw it with Al-Ghazali, with the Sufi practice that culminates in a kind of like direct experience of God and the reality of God and the reality of God's word and all that, the reality of the Quran. We saw it in Kierkegaard in a very different, but I think hopefully interestingly different form. Where it was sort of this like a sense of oneself as personally related to God, personally related to some transcendent other being, and the resulting fear and terror, the fear and trembling. I was actually thinking about that, like, and actually, like, there's a moment when I was reading Kierkegaard the last time, I actually kind of like, it almost struck me as vaguely Lovecraftian in a certain weird way. It's almost like what Kierkegaard was saying is like, imagine that an all-powerful, omnipotent, all-loving thing that created all of reality was staring at you. And just like staring right at you. And like, you're like, yeah, that's actually kind of creepy, right? That would be like some fear and trembling, right? Like the anxiety, and that's what Kierkegaard was, that is the experience, the religious experience that Kierkegaard was pointing toward, the religious terror of that experience, which has good correlates in the Old Testament. My favorite Old Testament story is where one of the prophets is brought up into heaven by angels, and the only thing he can comprehend is that the angels, who all look like flaming chariots with eyes on them, screaming as loud as they possibly can the Hebrew word holy, which just means other. So just like screaming other at God. Right, that there's like Yeah, this is not the deist god, certainly, right? That, like, pats you on the head, puts you on, sends you along the way or whatever, right? The one that Kierkegaard's talking about. Like that as a kind of experience. James is going to kind of like, that's what James is interested in. James is interested in these different kinds of experiences, and sort of seeing if he can come up with a grouping of religious experiences that can be distinguished from other kinds of experiences. That's what he's doing throughout the book. For those of you who have some background with William James, I don't know how many of you would. Actually, I know 2 of you should have, because I made you read it last semester in 19th century philosophy. But the rest of you, at least, I don't know how many of you have any background with James. William James is one of the founding figures in a philosophical school called American Pragmatism. There's others too, like Charles Peirce is big in it as well. But James is probably the biggest of the founders of that school. And so he's a pretty big deal philosophically, and his philosophical interests are actually pretty different than a lot of other thinkers. This caring about different kinds of experience thing, super in keeping with James's other pragmatist interests. And we'll get some little hints of his other pragmatic interests a little bit later on and today near the end of class, where we talk a little bit about the conclusion of this book, where he talks about whether or not these religious experiences are true. And the very pragmatic account of truth that he kind of gives or pushes in the direction toward, at least at the end of this work. So that's a little bit of an introduction. I mainly today just going to talk our way through the structure. Basically, James is going to turn out to be closest to Nietzsche, weirdly, of all the people we've read. It might not have gotten that impression from the intro, but actually he's going to be closest to Nietzsche in a lot of respects. And yeah, so we'll just sort of work our way through. We'll talk a little bit about the intro, talk about the whole work though too. I want to, as a whole, and try to give you a big picture summary of the different kinds of religious experiences and then what he does on the basis of that. So yeah, any initial questions about James, about the text, about anything? About this idea of religion as a kind of experience, anything? All right, awesome. So yeah, I think we probably won't. My guess is we're not going to go the whole day. We'll see, but we'll do a little bit with James, and then not as much as I had hoped. But you know, what are you going to do in life? All right, so let's first. I want to define this word, the divine. So, yeah, what is religion? He's pretty straightforward. Religion is the inner experience of being related to the divine. That's James's sort of definition that he gives us. And again, he doesn't care about the word. If you want to use the word to refer to something else, fine. This is the phenomenon that he's interested in. And so when we say inner, what are we crossing out, first of all? We're crossing off any kind of sort of like institutional, political-y kind of thing. So he's not talking about churches, not interested in talking about them. He's not talking about any kind of sort of like political organization, political movement, not interested in that regard. He's also not interested in ethics or ritual, at least not as such. Those things certainly might follow from certain kinds of experiences, and indeed, as might institutions and political kind of things might also follow. But he's just not interested in any of that either. I mean, as far as he's concerned, there's a key distinction between ethics and religion. And the distinction in ethics, you sort of do stuff. Religion involves you enthusiastically doing stuff. And he thinks that distinction is absolute. Like he just thinks that to him that there's a dramatic and obvious difference between this way in which when you're approaching a situation ethically that you sort of like do your duty and this sort of enthusiasm that characterizes religious engagement. Right? Even if that you're doing the same thing or you're not doing the same thing, right? Even if in both cases you're not, killing your neighbor or whatever, right? Like you're not killing your neighbor really differently, right? And the religious way of doing it is the way that he's interested, and that religious way only makes sense by understanding this enthusiasm as a kind of experience. And of course, he's playing here. The word enthusiasm literally comes from the Bible. The word to be enthused, to have a spirit in you. That's what the word literally means. To be filled with the Spirit is to be enthused. Right? Not that this experience is necessarily pleasant. As we're going to see, not all religious experiences are pleasant or enjoyable. That's not the same thing as saying that they're all going to be enthusiastic in a certain sense. And you might, and so again, the rituals, the institutions, even the ethical codes, the belief. He also says he's not really concerned with beliefs at all. Or specific religious theologies, the way specific religions interpret these experiences. He's not interested in that. The way he sort of characterizes himself, and again, that's why I say he's closest to is Nietzsche. Nietzsche characterizes himself in the same way, that he's acting sort of psychologically, or that his interests are sort of psychological interests. He wants to understand the state of people undergoing these things, right? How that should be interpreted, the theological questions or the belief questions, separate matter. He's just not going to worry too much about that. He mainly in this text talks from the Christian standpoint, but he's at least trying to do so non-exclusively. Like it's sort of like that's what he knows the best. So he's trying to he draws a lot of examples from those things, but he's not trying to interpret those experiences with use Christian terms. They're just examples of the kind of experiences that he's interested in. And he certainly gives examples that don't fit within Christianity. Some things, some Sufism, some things with Buddhism as well. Okay. So how are we doing so far? Good so far? Questions, thoughts, comments? All right. The next thing then, need to figure out what he means by the divine. And he basically says that the divine is that which you take serious. Or that which you treat as God-like. Doesn't have to actually be a god, but whatever you treat as if it was a god, things that you respond to solemnly and gravely and with seriousness. So religion is quite literally no joking matter. Right. So anything that you're being jokey about, by definition, that is something that you do not hold divine. Because if you held it as divine, you wouldn't be joking. Right? You would be being serious. You'd be being solemn. You'd be being reverential. And again, he's entirely open to the possibility that there's some people who don't take anything solemnly, gravely, and with reverence, and who treat everything as a joke. Voltaire, in the reading I had you all do, he cites Voltaire as perhaps an example of a man who sort of treated everything as a great jest. Fine. Then that person does not undergo religious experience if they're being truthful. If there's genuinely nothing that they hold reverence toward, or that they hold serious or solemn toward, then they hold nothing as divine. And we say that actually, right, is nothing, like sometimes we're talking about South Park maybe, right, is nothing is sacred in South Park. Right? Nothing is divine. Nothing is set off as solemn, grave, serious, worthy of reverence. So I think this is a compelling account. Actually, I think he does a pretty good job setting this off. What he has sort of double interests. He wants to leave a space for Buddhism. On the one hand, so that's one thing he wants to leave space for, because he doesn't think the Buddhists certainly don't worship any kind of god. He doesn't think they see seem to do anything sort of supernatural either, like all the difficulties we encountered earlier when we were trying to figure out what to do with Buddhism. Right? He thinks certainly the Buddhists treat the Buddha solemnly, gravely, and reverentially, at the very least, and they treat the Dharma that way. Right, whether it be part of an interpretation of nature or supernatural, whether it be transcendent or whatever. Right, and also he wants to leave room for non-personal philosophical principles to fit into here as well. Philosophers who maybe hold up truth or beauty or whatever as something, like these held up ideas as objects of reverence. In the reading I had you all do, he cites Emerson as an example, who we didn't read, so that probably wasn't super helpful. But later on in the book, he does Plato as an example too of what he has in mind here. And I did have you read a little. You do all know a little bit the Platonic stuff, so that could be it. To leave space for both of these things as involving a religious kind of experience. As a result, he's going to define the divine in this way, not worry about metaphysical statuses, not worry about personhood or any of that kind of thing. Again, how are we doing? All right. So when I say that he is like Nietzsche, we'll go back to the board in a little bit, but I want to do this. I want to do this without the board first. When I say that he's most like Nietzsche, he says that there are two broad families of religious experience. And basically, the two broad families are the world seems awesome and the world seems shitty. Those are the two broad categories of religious experience. Right? And again, the specifics are going to be broad. He calls these basically healthy-mindedness and sick-mindedness are the two categories. That's why, again, the Nietzsche, you should indeed be hearing Nietzsche in the background of the sick-mindedness. I think there's a relation there. Because actually, do you all remember how Nietzsche defined religion? We did look at it, but it was sort of like in passing. Let me refresh your memories. Nietzsche defined religion as the psychological and ethical response to the weariness of life. James agrees, but also argues that it could be a response to a kind of excess love of life. We have the healthy-minded religion and the sick-souled religious experience. They don't have to be all or nothing, but at least as orientations they are. These are mutually opposed orientations toward religious experience. Now, within the same person, they might happen to overlap or whatever, right? We don't have to make that strong of a claim. Maybe at different parts of our life, sometimes we're healthy-minded, other times we're sick-souled, whatever, right? And again, notice that these are psychological descriptions. He's not actually saying that there's actually anything in fact wrong or not wrong, right? This isn't a diagnosis. These are just accounts of the psyche of the person. He's not diagnosing the person as actually healthy or actually sick, but that how they're experiencing themselves is as healthy or as sick in a very real sense. Again, good so far? Questions, thoughts, anything? All right. So let's do the healthy-minded first. The healthy-minded person is the person who just like looks at a mountain and is like, damn, look at that mountain. It's majestic. It's beautiful, right? Like, how could the world have made mountains like this? Right? And like, look at me just like sitting here looking at this mountain. Wow. Damn. It's like a really good acid trip, right? Like, this is where the acid trip goes well. Right? Where like, you know, you're having a really mellow high. Where like everything is, you're constantly being awed by the beauty of the things you encounter. This is how Kant describes his religious experience. Actually, Kant describes that there's two things that fill his heart with wonder. Kant says, and the first is the stars above him, just literally science, like as studying the stars and like looking at their majesty and the grandeur and the enormity of their scale and all of that. Like that fills him with wonder. And the second thing is contemplating the moral law embedded within the heart of humanity. That too fills, like those things fill him with wonder, with grandeur, with glory, with a sense of the world's greatness and of his own greatness as part of it. That all sounds a little master morality, doesn't it? A smidge. That's a little smidge of it, at least, right? Because it's positive. It's like defining things from the standpoint of strength. Like this would be the attitude of like experiences where everything just seems full. Taylor was calling this earlier the experience of fullness, right? Where everything feels like full and potent and pregnant and possible, and the world is working and you're working and everything is there. And indeed, that was what Taylor called the experience of fullness. That was his experience of fullness, right? This thing that we all sometimes have moments like this, right? And then different people interpret differently. The sickly soul actually also has some correspondence with Taylor. The sickly soul moment is the moment when you're like, I'm looking at this mountain and all I feel is my own wretchedness. All I feel is my own inadequacy. Maybe compared to the mountain, or maybe even like in the mountain itself, like maybe underlying the mountain, you're like, there is like sickness and rot and decay. It's like, do I see nature as beauty, or do I see nature as that dead or rotting bird? Because of course, nature's both, right? Like, I mean, like nature doesn't really care. Like nature is just a process that whereby a bunch of stuff happens. Nature doesn't really care if you find it beautiful or not, right? In some moments, you might even be able to look at the dead bird and find beauty there. But in other moments, you're gonna look at the dead bird and be like, that's what I am too. I'm just like a corpse that hasn't yet finished rotting. Right? And you know, so maybe we're talking about death here. Maybe the sickly soul person is like constantly experiencing a certain kind of like terror at death. Maybe they're experiencing a kind of sickly horror at sin. They experience a kind of evil within themselves or within the world that they don't know what to do with. This is sort of remainder of the darkness. And Taylor, he was calling this these moments of alienation. These moments where meaning seems like a million miles away. Where fulfilled, you can't even maybe even remember you ever felt filled. In some sense, like what you have is just like a sense of the lack, the sense of what's missing. Again, that should sound a little slave morality. Again, maybe not like in terms of the specifics, but in terms of the structure, right? Like something is wrong. Something needs to be explained. And in a lot of,
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
So I can't find it in the reading. I was trying to find it, but so for example, when we're looking at a mountain and either thinking about the beauty of the mountain or ourselves,
Right.
or the wretchedness of the mountain and ourselves, or sin or whatever, that's in the context of us believing in the divine, right? Or is there a possibility that we are feeling this without the context of
Yeah.
believing in the divine?
That's a really good question. So for what James is talking about, he is talking about this in the sense in which the mountain, let's use the mountain as an example. The mountain is at least being held to stand in for something divine. So maybe I'm not saying the mountain is actually a god or something, right? But I'm saying that like maybe the mountain is sort of like pointing toward a kind of divinity, right? And it's wow, that divinity is super full, or wow, that divinity, or wow, I'm super empty in relation to that divinity, the solemnness that it deserves, or seriousness that it deserves. That's a really good point. What he says is, he didn't say this in the reading that I had you all do, but later on he specifies what he's talking about here is this presupposing a non-neurotic person. So like a neurotic person can like feel wretched without any sense of the divine, right? Or maybe if you're bipolar or something, right? Maybe you can feel really up without any sense of reverence either. He's precisely not talking about that. He thinks that's a thing too, and that can make this even worse if you might be undergoing some sort of neurotic behavior too. But we want to put all that on hold for a little bit. He's proposing someone of generally sound-minded, right? Who nevertheless like is experiencing and standing in relation to, just like you were saying, the divine in one of these two ways. So these are two ways of being related to the experience of something as having something divine about it. There's something divine about it, and so I fall short. What am I, this wretched thing? Or there's something divine about it, and so wow, everything's awesome. Like that mountain, man. That mountain redeems the whole world. Right? Or that novel, or that whatever, right? Like something about it is sort of redeeming the whole thing. That help?
So can I ask a follow-up question
Yeah,
to that? So then if we are looking at it in the context of the divine and someone who's not neurotic,
right.
Then I think James mentioned it was like religious love, right? Or
That's right.
something like that, or like religious awe.
Mm-hmm.
Is that also connected to what you're saying?
Yeah, that would be really, and I think that plays itself out in the words too, like the word awe, right? I mean, the word awe is the root of our word awesome and the root of our word awful. Right? Because what inspires awe in us? What inspires awe in us is that which is beyond our ability to fully grasp. And you could either interpret that as like awesome in the sense of like overstuffed, or you could interpret that as awful in the sense of like terrifying. Right? That which diminishes me, shows my irrelevance, shows my unimportance in the grand scheme of things, or the ways in which I fall short. So yeah, I think like a word like awe in English sort of does capture the double sense of it. Right? We have awe toward the divine, but that's awesome or awful. And it's the same awe in either case. It's just interpreted really differently. Similarly, in the some of the existentialists talk about this. James is not an existentialist, but he's tangentially related to them in some respects, at least. Where like the Greeks did really seem to have this sort of healthy mindedness thing. Like the word that the Greeks use to describe this is thalmasdein, which is the word we would translate normally as wonder. So like where something like fills us with wonder. Whereas like moderns, the existentialists say, we sort of no longer seem to be able to experience wonder. We just experience anxiety. And it's like our reaction to the same thing, Kierkegaard, fear and trembling, right? Whereas the Greeks stood in wonder at their gods, so like Heidegger is the one who Heidegger says this. We sort of like are anxious in the face of them. They fill us with like, again, this sort of feeling of inadequacy, of lack, of not having. Whereas maybe for whatever reason for the Greeks, they experienced it as like, wow, isn't the world great? That it has this like excess of meaning to it. Good. Any other questions?
Hi, Professor.
Go ahead, Angela.
Yeah, I have a question that like exactly extends on this one.
Mhm.
Does like William James like elaborate on like how that idea of like sickly versus healthy soul would relate to the like Edmund Burke's concept of like sublime, where the terrifying and the painful is like part of it and
Right.
like essential in the right proportion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think from James's perspective, that would be an interpretation of this. right? That the truth is sort of both of them, right? And so that we would need to experience both in kind of due measure or something like that. Yeah, I think from James's perspective, that would, because I think James would say like you never experience both of them at the same time in the same way. Like you sort of like, and maybe Burke would say you do actually. Like maybe Burke would sort of say like it is like you do sort of have like the combo experience or something. But I think James is more thinking of these as yeah, he's doing it from part because of the way he's looking at Christianity as a source. Where like basically you have Christian saints who are like life is awesome, and Christian saints who are like I deserve to be torn apart by lions. And you don't have a lot of like Christian saints who are like, I am awesome and also deserve to be torn apart by lions.
Right. So like, would he say then, or like maybe he just like not interested in that like other phenomenon of it, but or like would he say that it's like not possible to experience like both beauty and pain at the same time?
It's a good question. I don't want to speak too strongly because I'm not 100% sure how he would react to that question. It's a good question. My sense is he would think that something like the sublime is a way of like, yeah, like, I think my sense is that would be something like an interpretation of these experiences for him, rather than the root experience itself. And the reason,
so like it's not.
Yeah, go ahead.
Also, I was gonna say it's like more like a framework, not like the root phenomenon.
I think that's my impression of how James would talk about it, at least, because yeah, like that's getting more into sort of like theological territory almost, right? Like, should we see God as, maybe we should just see God? Maybe the fullness answer is the only real answer, right? And maybe there's something sinful about the six-fold orientation. Like maybe that's, if you go, maybe if you're Plato or something, you're like, that's like the bad Christian stuff that they added. They added all this guilt stuff that we need to get rid of. That actually the experience of God is just one. It is just wonder. It should just fill you with awe and impressiveness, and none of this sort of like I'm unworthy. I'm unworthy. And Nietzsche would certainly say that, right? So that's why I would be tempted to say that's more the sublime, where it's sort of like a mixture of the two. Is kind of just like another interpretation of the experiences that sees them as compatible rather than opposed, maybe.
Okay, thank you, that makes sense.
Awesome, good. Yeah, and the one thing I want to, we haven't gotten there yet, but one thing I want to emphasize as well, based on Anthony's question, is that the six-fold, that's not necessarily going to be a painful experience. In some cases it will, but there's also going to be, you get like a positive thing out of it too. That we'll need to talk about in a second too. Basically, you get the pleasure of conversion, because it's only the six-fold person who sees themselves as needing to be saved, but you then get the pleasure of maybe the experience of being saved. So I'll add that. That's sort of part of this six-fold religious experience, is the experience of conversion, salvation. Because you only can experience salvation if you see yourself as needing to be saved. Right? You can only experience yourself as turning back toward God if you already first experienced yourself as having turned away from God. Right? And I really was going to have you read a bunch of this stuff, actually, because there's some really cool stuff in the chapters about where he's really playing with here is St. Augustine. Because I don't know if any of you have read St. Augustine, but St. Augustine is definitely this. St. Augustine is like, I am like wretched in the eyes of the Lord. Like my experience of myself is as completely powerless, completely divided in my own will, such that I will that which I hate, and I hate that which I love. In his case, he's talking about it in the context of basically sex addiction. He says the thing holding him, the Confessions is his spiritual autobiography. And he says that the thing that was holding him back from fully embracing God was that like he'd have to give up having sex with prostitutes, basically, and he really liked having sex with prostitutes. So he basically describes himself as like having this like divided will, this will torn at odds with itself, that like what he loves God he hates, he turns away from, and what he hates, having sex with the prostitutes, he loves and turns towards. Right? And so like for him, so that's how he experiences the divine. Is quite literally how he experiences God is as the sort of wretchedness of his own torn condition. And James gives a reading of all of this because it's very psychologically vivid in the Confessions. So James sort of has a field day with it. And so but it's only from that standpoint, it's only seeing himself as sort of irredeemably depraved that he can then experience conversion, right? That he can experience his will as being fixed, such that now that he loves what he loves, right? And that his own powerlessness to bring it about, that he needs God to bring it about for him. And I mean, he's not Calvin, but this is what Calvin is heavily inspired. Calvin's total human depravity doctrine is very much inspired by St. Augustine. Because St. Augustine also talks in this way sometimes too. But at least in the Confessions anyway, this is the way in which he is presenting his experience. It has joy to it though, the joy of the conversion, the joy of salvation, right? The joy of being saved from the darkness in which he found himself. And that's part of the sickly experience. So it's both sort of like the pain of alienation and the joy of reconciliation. Which again, it's a very Christian way of putting it. That's very much how Christianity talks. But yeah, that's how Augustine kind of puts the point. And so that would at least we at least need to keep in mind that that's part of the sort of sick-souled experience, the sort of sickly experience of being sick for James. How are you doing? Good, still good here? This person presumably doesn't experience any such thing, right? Where would be the need for it? Almost, right? There's nothing that needs to be fixed. Exactly. All right. Good. So let's now. He adds to actually no. I'll save mysticism to the end. I'm going to go a little out of order from the text. I think we're actually in a really good position now to say why James thinks religion is good. James actually argues in the conclusion of this text that psychologically speaking, religion is as a result of mostly this, but also this, that religion is the most psychologically valuable experiences that humans have in terms of psychological health. That they are health promoting experiences. And why, in this case, that one's maybe obvious, right? Where you sort of are like feeling at peace and at home in the world. Great. Right? But in this one too, not so much because of the alienation stuff, but because of the conversion salvation stuff, right? That you get from the sort of sick-souled kind of religious experience. Right? That this has enormous positive psychological health benefits. And again, damn, this should sound a lot to you like Nietzsche. Nietzsche says the same thing, but way more dismissively, way more cruelly, right? Nietzsche's like, yeah, if you suck, you probably do need religious experiences to stay alive. Right? Like, yeah, if you're not strong enough to face the world with eyes open, then yeah, you do need that was what he said about the ascetic priest, right? The ascetic priest is the doctor, and this is the cure that the ascetic, or the treatment at least, that the ascetic priest can offer to those who are sick. Right? Can offer to those who are sick, in this sense of sick-souled, can offer them the kind of salvation conversion kind of experience that sort of like makes the world livable and genuinely brings peace. Like the way James conceptualizes this, like you actually genuinely get a kind of peace from this. You'll get a genuine sense that everything will be okay, even if you're still sort of experiencing it also simultaneously, it's kind of not okay. It's not okay, but you get from the conversion experience a sense that nevertheless things will be okay even though they're not okay. And again, you know, through the divine, in some sense, maybe through the intercessionary activity of the divine in some capacity. Right? The thing that James is adding to this Nietzsche is that you also get some ones that aren't so obviously fixing a problem. Right? You also have the healthy-minded religious experience, which Nietzsche just seems to just dismiss, or he doesn't really seem to consider that would genuinely be possible. He sort of seems to treat it as if all religious experience has to reduce to the sixfold. But James is just like, no, there are some moments in your life when the mountain's just like, damn, that mountain. Oh, that poem, that song. And like that too, like is almost like the little bit of the cherry on top of living life well. And that little cherry also has psychological health benefits. And so, yeah, I mean, you could kind of say, at the very least, maybe cut out the weariness part. You just say that religion is the psychological and ethical response to life. Yeah, I don't know if James would have a problem with that. James is like, yeah, kind of. Right? It's a psychological mechanism whereby humans become healthier, right? Through the psychological benefits produced by these particular kinds of experiences. And that's why, again, like we don't need to even talk about the institutional level or the level of morality or the level of doctrine or anything. It's beneficial purely on the psychological level, purely as a kind of experience that's like good for healthy humans to have. How are we doing? Is this stuff making some sense? Interesting, unexpected comparisons, hopefully. Back to the Taylor, back to some Nietzsche, back to the beginning of the semester stuff a little bit. All right, let's go back now to mysticism. Right? Because there's also another kind of experience James thinks that we get, that religious experience that we get too. That's a little bit different from either of the other two. And he calls this other kind of experience mystical experience. And again, we've already talked about examples of mystical experiences. We've talked about them in the context of the Buddhists. We talked about them in the context of the Sufis. There are Platonic traditions that seek these things. There are Christian monastic traditions. The various guys. Yeah, he wants all of this to be super broad and cover a wide variety of things. We might say maybe certain sort of shamanic traditions involve mystical experiences, or animist traditions. Maybe if you drop some acid, maybe that could give you a mystical experience. Yeah, it's all supposed to be so broad, so general, that we're not like specifying any particular tradition or talking about any particular tradition. We're talking about something broader than that. All right. So he characterizes mystical traditions as having 4 characteristics. So first, mystical traditions are ineffable. They can't be put into words. Right? There's something that there's sort of a limit point for discursive philosophy. They're things that present themselves at least as if they can never be sort of discursively exhausted. And again, that totally matches how Al-Ghazali was talking about the Sufi practice, right? That actually Sufis don't really say what it is that they experience because you're not going to get it. It's not going to work. You have to experience it yourself. Similarly with the Buddhists as well, right? That again, this is something you have to do for if you really want to understand it, this is something you have to do for yourself. The Buddha can sort of tell you some things to help you along the way, but if you want to understand it, you have to do it. You have to undergo it. Second, he calls them noetic, which is not a word you're all probably familiar with. So let me translate that Greek word into English. They are knowledge producing. They reveal, again, he's not talking about the reality. This is how the experience presents itself. Whether that's actually true or not, that's a separate question. Doesn't care. But the experience presents itself as producing some kind of profound understanding or producing some kind of profound knowledge in the person who undergoes the experience. Third, he adds that these are transient states, which I'm a little bit not clear why he adds this qualification, actually. It also seems like it runs afoul. It involves some interpretation. Right? But he seems to assume that this is something that you're not in all the time. It's sort of an interruption of the normal or the everyday. Perhaps, I'm not sure if that's exactly where he's going here, but that's my best guess as to why he adds this, because the Buddhists aren't going to say that the Buddha is just in a transient experience, has like transient experiences of enlightenment. Like, that's not, the Buddha is enlightened. He's enlightened all the time. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I only have transient experiences. But, and again, similarly, like within the Sufi tradition, Muhammad didn't just have transient instances of being in direct contact with God. Muhammad was always in direct contact with God. But my sense is that the idea here is this idea of the interrupting of the everyday. That's my best guess as to why. And then the last condition he adds is that I experience this as something that I cannot do on my own. And so, therefore, in turn, then something divine is bringing it about within me. So I experience myself as passive with respect to the advent of the mystical experience. I experience it as, if I'm a Sufi, God moving through me. Or if I'm a Buddhist, maybe it's weirder to characterize this in Buddhism, but maybe I experience this as a kind of not self rather than a self. It isn't a me doing. This is actually a not self, and a not I, rather than a selfing, a doing and acting. And so these experiences also seem as if they might give us knowledge. And he puts all of this with mights and maybes, right? But maybe, right? That's at least how the experience is presenting itself anyway, is that it's revealing something important that can't be revealed in the normal ways we go about getting knowledge. Because the normal ways we go about getting knowledge are all about like talking, right? Basically, human being as the animal that never shuts up. They're just always yakking, trying to understand everything that's going on, right? That those normal methods, science, if you want to call it that, won't, if there is something here, it's not going to get revealed through the science. It can only get revealed through this kind of religious experience. Right? And so again, we find that the religious experience is beneficial. And again, sort of like regardless of its truth value, question mark? Like kinda, yeah. I mean, like I think the implication of what he's saying is that like even if there's nothing to any of this, the experience itself reveals something. Right? So maybe the specific interpretation of the religions isn't right, but the experience still reveals something either way. And so the religion in the sense of the interpretation. That, true or false, who knows, right? But the experience would nevertheless be beneficial to us. knowledge producing. And that's an additional kind of benefit on top of the benefits we had just been talking about earlier. The sort of like health, the psychic health benefits that we might get from it as well. Again, how's possible? How are we doing? Questions, thoughts, anything good here? All right, so let's jump to the conclusion. Then it's like a 500-page book, so I'm obviously zooming. I'm obviously just zooming through it. But let's jump to the conclusion then. Right. So our religious experience is true. He's established he thinks that they're beneficial. Right? They do good for us. They're good for us. Does that make them true? He concedes, no, that would be too strong. That would be, we can't just say anything beneficial to us is true. But they could be true depending on how they fit into our various other beliefs. If they're so this actually is James is the founder of this American Pragmatism School. This is the account the American pragmatists give of truth. Something is true if it's beneficial and doesn't cause a contradiction with my other beliefs. So we've got the first condition. We got beneficial. If in addition, these religious experiences don't contradict anything else that I believe and know, then we got something that indeed does sound as if it would be true. Right? Things that are revealing genuine, true features of the world. Right? And it doesn't matter. And it would, again, we're still talking the level of experience. We have the level of interpretation and theology and all that stuff. You'd have even more burdens to establish consistency with other beliefs and all that. But yeah, I mean, James's sense is, and we see this in other places, is that like at the very minimum, he thinks human beings are being completely rational when they devote themselves to religion. Okay? He doesn't think he can prove that they're right and that he's right because he's doing this too, obviously, right? Maybe that's not obvious, but yeah, James himself is quite religious. Actually, all the American pragmatists weirdly are quite religious within versions of Protestant Christianity in all their cases. Actually, Pierce might be a Catholic. Actually, I might be wrong about that. James is Protestant, definitely. Pierce might be a Catholic. I might misremembering there. But regardless, right? At the very least, someone who chooses to like make the commitment toward it is not acting irrationally. And that's the conclusion of a different essay, James's Will to Believe, is that actually, like, yeah, religious belief is just as rational as religious not belief at a minimum. And look at all the positive, psychic benefits we get from it, right? Like, look how healthy it is on top of that. And look at all the knowledge it produces, right? So it's beneficial. It's good for us. You're not irrational to believe in it. So yeah, go for it. And in James, his attitude is always incredibly pluralistic with this. He's not saying like, so Protestant Christians. He means like, no, humans, experiment, try shit out. Sufis, you try out that Sufi thing. Tell me how it goes. Right? Buddhists, try out the Buddhist thing. You crazy Platonists out there, because the Pragmatists have a very ambivalent relationship with Plato. But like you crazy Platonists, maybe you try being crazy Platonists and see what happens as a result of that. Maybe you really will give us a better definition of truth than this pragmatic one we've come up with. Maybe try it out. Let's see. Okay. The attitude is we all start from the basis of having these experiences, at least in principle. We could all have these experiences. Right? If we hold anything at all as divine or sacred, right? As serious as solemn, and let's try out some different stuff and see what happens. And the other stuff that works will live. The stuff that doesn't work will die off. Pragmatic, pluralistic religion, and that's what James is after. That's where James goes with all of this. All right. So there you go. We just did all 500 pages. We've gone through all the varieties of religious experience. No, we haven't. But this is at least a broad summary, anyway, of James. I wanted to at least give you that much, so that you could I was sort of hoping James would be sort of like a good period as our last reading for the semester a little bit. Like one way of interpreting this sort of the experience kind of interpretation of religion. What would that look like? I think James is a good and very interesting exemplar of it. coming from, as opposed to the Sufis who are coming from a Sufi way, James coming from a more open-y, pluralistic kind of way for what that could look like, to sort of see religion in this fashion. See it as the grand experiment with taking things seriously. Yeah, so the real enemy would be South Park, right? Like that would be the actual that would be the actual danger, right? Because that's like that's the standpoint from which you could never have this experience. Like a South Point is the standpoint from which you take nothing seriously. Or maybe Rick and Morty is probably the more contemporary. Which I have watched, by the way. Now I have watched, as some of you are pressuring me to watch it. I have watched Rick and Morty since I taught philosophy and science fiction last time. So that would be maybe a more contemporary where like not taking anything sacred, not treating anything as divine, and that would close off these kinds of experiences to you. All right. So that's all I have. I'm good. I'm good for the day. How are you? How are you all? How are you? Got some questions? Got some thoughts? Got some more to talk about here, or should we call it?
I have one more question.
Absolutely, go ahead.
So like the second condition of like pragmatic truth, as far as I understand it, you said that like it doesn't contradict any of your other beliefs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, but how can you be sure that all of your other beliefs are valid enough to be a test against the validity of the new belief?
Within pragmatism generally? Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm not a pragmatist, so I don't want to. I share that worry in some respects. I think James's answer, at least, James's answer to that question is going to be, well, experience is going to take care of that for you in a sense, right? Like if there's some wild inconsistency in your belief, that's going to manifest itself at some point, right? Like I'm going to believe two things and it's going to produce a contradiction and I'm not going to know how to act and I'll have to figure out how to act and that'll resolve my contradiction. That'll be how I sort of resolve it. I mean, for him, experience is always the test of truth and of things like consistency. Or you ask the same question, how do we know it's beneficial to us, actually? Experience will tell us, right? Well, try it out and the experience will tell us if this was beneficial or not beneficial. So the way he's imagining it is it's kind of like this almost experimental method where like reality is, my beliefs are constantly going to be being tested by reality, and that will be the proof that things are consistent. I actually don't need to do the sort of like philosophy or Descartes like list all of my beliefs out and check for contradictions. I just have to live, and reality will sort of do that for me. If I'm being serious, like if I'm seriously attending to my experiences, that will reveal contradictions within my beliefs.
Right. So just like reality and time.
Yeah.
But then like at random, or is there like does he have like any systematic way of like reality so to create reality that can test those beliefs?
He does have a way. I haven't studied it exhaustively. He has something he calls radical empiricism, which is a method of empiricism that's supposed to be he basically sees the sort of like normal Locke science kind of empiricism as kind of just like shallow and not really that empirical even. So he has what he calls kind of like radical form of empiricism. It's super weird and some super strange stuff starts to happen. He kind of sounds like he's becoming a German idealist if you really start pushing on what he seems to mean by experience at a certain point. But that at least would be where he goes to try to answer that question. The essay is called Radical Experience, actually, where he basically is trying to work out a kind of epistemological framework, sort of epistemological / metaphysical, actually, framework by which we can better sort of understand experience such that it can serve as a better touchstone to things like truth. Yeah.
Radical empiricism?
Yeah, that's what he calls it. That's what he calls it. Radical empiricism. Yeah. It's
okay, awesome. Thank you.
It's very weird, but which is why I didn't teach it in 19th century philosophy. It's interesting though. It's interesting, but yeah, that's where he tries to sort of answer that problem.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Awesome. Anyone have anything else for me? All right. Well, one class left. Well, it's not, I'm not gonna have you do. I have a very short reading for you. It's like a 2-page article, and it's not a philosophy article. I just saw it a couple days ago, and I thought it was hilarious based on what we've been talking about. And I just wanted you all to read it just as a reminder of maybe where we started from. The title of this article is "Some Atheists Are More Religious Than Religious People." And the conclusion of the article is, maybe we need to rethink what we mean by the word religion. So it's a very short little article. Just read over, skim over. We'll talk about it a little bit. Just use it maybe as a framework. We'll do some just sort of big picture, end of the semester stuff. Talk a little bit of paper strategies for the paper, and then wind ourselves down. So that'll be what we do on Thursday. Hope you all have a good rest of your week. Good rest as the semester comes closer to its end. Things go well, and don't hesitate to let me know if you got any paper questions or anything like that. All right, have a good one, and I will talk to you all on Thursday. Bye.